After President Trump initiated the tariff war on April 5th, the global landscape was thrown into disarray. Manufacturing industries worldwide are filled with apprehension, while financial markets experience jolts several times a day. On April 9th, US time, Trump formally declared that China would face an additional tariff of 125% effective immediately. Meanwhile, noting that over 75 countries have proactively contacted the United States, expressing readiness to negotiate on matters such as tariff trade barriers, currency manipulation, and non-monetary restrictions, and given that these nations have refrained from retaliating against the US, he agreed to postpone imposing tariffs on them for 90 days. During this period, these countries will be subject to a baseline tariff of 10%. China stands alone as the exception. Combined with the prior 20% fentanyl tariff, China now contends with an effective tariff rate of 145%. In essence, Trump's position signals one clear intent. This tariff war ultimately aims to confront China. As of April 9th, the United States and China have officially entered the arena of a decisive struggle. I urge you to mark this date in your memory. Years from now, history will also recall this moment as the day the US and China commenced their critical showdown. To state it plainly, the Third World War has begun, manifesting as a tariff conflict between these two powers. 2 points require clarification here. First, prior to the tariff war's onset on April 5th, the average US tariff rate stood at 5.6%. When the tariff war was announced that day, the base rate rose to 10%, nearly doubling, and additional tariffs of varying rates were imposed on nearly 90 countries and regions. Now, Trump has stated that, apart from China, the additional tariffs on other nations will be deferred for 90 days, though the 10% base tariff remains in place. This indicates that the United States will sustain a 10% baseline tariff level for the foreseeable future. Annual U.S. tariff revenue amounts to approximately $80 billion. This sum is modest, historically constituting less than 2% of total federal revenue and never serving as a primary funding source for the government. Presently, the administration has significantly elevated the base tariff rate, yet it simultaneously wages an intense trade war with China. Imports from China will inevitably decline sharply as a result. These opposing forces will largely cancel each other out, meaning U.S. tariff revenue is unlikely to increase and may even decrease slightly. Beyond China, no other nation has mounted a significant counteroffensive against the United States. In early April, the European Parliament approved a plan to impose retaliatory tariffs on $21 billion worth of goods. However, it must be emphasized that this response was not directed at the April 5th tariff war, but rather at US tariffs levied on Europe's steel sector on March 12th. In other words, it took Europe a full month to retaliate against the March sanctions. With US exports to Europe totaling roughly $330 billion, Europe's $21 billion countermeasure represents a mere 6%, a negligible impact. In sum, it is China alone that has risen to challenge the United States in direct and fierce opposition. Both nations have now stepped into the ring for a duel, and this contest will persist until one side is utterly defeated. Victory will be determined when one suffers an economic rupture, a devastating collapse, allowing the other to claim triumph. Should either nation descend into prolonged stagnation, the struggle will continue indefinitely, which cannot be deemed a genuine victory. This tempest bearing down upon us touches every individual and will fundamentally alter the trajectories of countless lives. The days of tender warmth, tranquil years, and lives resonant with melody have vanished irrevocably. Aspirations for a bright future, long-term life plans, and firm expectations of rising income have all dissolved into fleeting dreams. For China's industrial economy, the strain of this monumental confrontation may exceed anything you or I can fathom. In 2024, China's goods exports to the US reached $524.6 billion, On the surface, with total goods exports amounting to $2,585.1 billion, US-bound exports constitute just 20.3%. It might appear that losing this 20% would not devastate China's economy, that it could endure. Yet, since the US-China trade war commenced in 2018, elevating bilateral tariffs to 20%, vast quantities of Chinese goods have been redirected through Southeast Asia and Mexico to enter the US, evading those steep duties. The total value of these rerouted goods is estimated at around $500 billion as well. Consider this. In 2017, China exported $71 billion worth of goods to Vietnam. By 2024, that figure climbed to $161.9 billion. The additional $90.9 billion largely reflects goods rerouted via Vietnam. Similarly, exports to Mexico rose from $35.9 billion in 2017 to $129.8 billion in 2024, with the extra $93.9 billion primarily representing goods redirected to the US. Exports to Malaysia also grew, from $41.7 billion to $101.5 billion, with the additional $59.8 billion likely rerouted to the US as well. I will not exhaustively list every instance here. Altogether, this rerouting trade approximates $500 billion. Thus, the true scale of Chinese exports to the US exceeds $1 trillion, comprising slightly over 40% of China's total export volume. This aligns with common experience. For any enterprise engaged in export trade, survival is nearly impossible without US-bound business. Moreover, exports to the US represent, without exception, the most lucrative segment for Chinese trade firms. Often these companies depend on US exports to offset losses elsewhere. That 40% share reveals the stark reality of China's export landscape. On the US side, annual goods imports total about $4 trillion, with $1 trillion supplied directly or indirectly by China, accounting for a quarter of its goods imports. Now, with this confrontational escalation, that $1 trillion worth of Chinese goods can no longer rely on entering the US market. It will contract sharply in short order. I estimate that within a year, it may dwindle to just $200 or $300 billion, as a reduction of roughly 80%. The loss of this highly profitable export sector will plunge China's entire export industry into near total collapse. No alternative market can substitute for the US. From manufacturing to associated trade sectors, hundreds of millions will face immediate unemployment with no means of resistance. For the United States, the task is to replace the $1 trillion in goods China supplies directly or indirectly. In 2024, US retail sales of physical goods totaled $7.4 trillion. Even if Chinese supply fell to zero within a year, that would represent a 13% reduction in supply. This shortfall would undoubtedly affect the domestic retail market, though the impact would not be catastrophic. During this period, the US will seek other suppliers. While they may not fully replace China, they could cover approximately $800 billion worth. This leaves the United States with a supply gap of, at most, $200 to $300 billion, less than 5%. Critically, the United States is a leading producer of energy and food. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement and elimination of stringent environmental policies have unshackled the energy and agricultural sectors, reducing production costs by at least 30%. To further suppress energy prices, he has even reinstated coal production. In 2015, the Obama administration introduced the Clean Power Plan, targeting the US coal industry. Most coal mines shuttered within 2 years due to burdensome environmental costs. Trump has now abolished that plan, lifting restrictions on coal production and removing all additional environmental levies on the sector. As a coal-rich nation with vast reserves, the United States stands to benefit. By freeing the coal industry, Trump ensures that societal energy costs will decline markedly, maintaining control over energy and agricultural prices. With these two fundamental necessities secured, a supply shortfall below 5% poses no substantial threat to the US economy. Americans might reduce their annual per capita clothing purchases from 70 items to just over 60, still an exceedingly comfortable standard of living. This is the foundation of Trump's confidence in launching this tariff showdown with China. For China, however, what strategies could mitigate an export contraction totaling $800 billion? I find myself at a loss for answers. The US now scrutinizes all nations vigilantly, and countries previously facilitating China's rerouting trade have faced reprimands. The US Commerce Department has explicitly stated that in the forthcoming 90-day negotiations, these nations must rigorously prohibit the rerouting of Chinese goods. This effectively closes off any indirect means of profiting from the American market. Currently, those $800 billion in export goods equate to roughly 6 trillion RMB. Predominantly high-end consumer products requiring absorption by retail markets. The question of who will consume these premium goods surpasses China's economic capacity. Consumption in China's prosperous eastern cities is contracting. Amid a severe unemployment surge, spending is downgrading nationwide. The country cannot conjure 6 trillion RMB to compensate export firms for lost orders. That capacity will simply vanish, and workers across related supply chains will lose their livelihoods. Their joblessness will spark a domino effect, further slashing consumption, leading to more business failures and additional unemployment. This harrowing scenario exemplifies an economic rupture. For China today, persisting on its current course renders such a fracture unavoidable. When options are exhausted, transformation becomes imperative. China may pursue one of two paths. The first, as I've frequently noted, is a shift to a great suppression mode, reviving rationing and a planned economy, confining the populace within a metaphorical arena where mutual denunciation and strife are encouraged, ultimately halving the population to alleviate economic strain. In this process, token low-intensity foreign conflicts might be staged to justify isolationism. The second path is reform, establishing a free and equitable market system to reconcile with the US. Which direction China will take remains to be seen, and we can only watch as events unfold. Thanks for watching and joining us on this journey to unveil China's many layers. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated. See you in the next video.